In the last video, we talked about the optimization stuff for the household and the firm in the new Keynesian model. So we explained how each part, right, the household and the firm both had a like two-step process to their optimization. We talked about the tiny little, individual consumer goods that get aggregated up to a final consumer good. And we talked about the firm basically setting their prices via the relationship with the expected future marginal cost. And that's kind of how they will set their prices currently above marginal cost, because if they expect shocks to hit at some point in the future when they don't think they'll be able to change their price, right? They don't want to get screwed over in the future, so they're going to set their price a little high now in order to make up for that later. Now, bear in mind, they can't just set their price as high as they want because, well, they have to be able to price on the demand curve, and the elasticity of demand is going to have a lot to do with that. So firms in this model are still constrained in their pricing by the demand curve, just like in the real business cycle model. It's just in this case, the demand for these consumer goods, right, is not perfectly elastic anymore. So if we don't have perfectly elastic demand, well, it's not this flat line, right? It's going to be some kind of a downward sloping something or other. And that will determine how they can set their price. So it's the elasticity of demand is going to matter a lot, which is why price is a markup of marginal cost based on the elasticity of demand. So we covered all that fun stuff. And now we're going to talk about the monetary authority, what the monetary authority is tasked with, and how monetary policy can affect the equilibrium in this model. So without further ado, we're getting started. So the monetary authority plays a substantial role now. In the real business cycle model, there was no role for the monetary authority to respond in any way to what's going on in the economy because, well, there was no model there was no equation that gave the monetary policy stuff like a reaction function, right? The monetary authority didn't have a reaction function. So they were exogenous, just like the government spending was exogenous in that model. They're endogenous in this model. So what I mean by that is if monetary policy and government spending are endogenous in this model, if something happens in the model, if there's some kind of a shock, a negative demand shock, let's say, or negative supply, well, let's go with negative demand shock. There's a negative demand shock that comes in. Well, in the real business cycle model, monetary policy didn't do anything to deal with that. And the new Keynesian model, it does, because monetary policy now follows this function that responds to other changes within the model itself. So if certain conditions change in the model, then monetary policy is going to respond in a way that tries to offset whatever this shock was to try to return everything back to like its nice, stable, long-run equilibrium. Now here in this model, right, in order to try to achieve that long-run equilibrium, they want to close something called the output gap. And the output gap is if there is a flexible price output, right, like the output in the real business cycle model. If we assume that that does exist in the new Keynesian model, because remember, long-run stuff still works for the new Keynesian model very much in the way that it did in the RBC model. It's just the stuff in between now and the long run that things didn't really work out very well. If the flexible price output is the output from the RBC model, where omega is equal to 0, in which there are no nominal rigidities whatsoever, the output gap is just the difference between what the actual output is observed by the new Keynesian model, in which that omega term is not 0, where prices are somewhat sticky. It's the difference between that and what output would be if prices were totally flexible. Now, the output gap is this. We'll call it x sub t, and it's the difference between what output actually is, yt, and the flexible price output, yt superscript f, f for flexible. So the difference between the actual output and the flexible price output is the output gap. If actual observed output is above the flexible price output, the output gap is positive. If the output is below the flexible price output? Well, then the output gap is negative. A positive output gap means we are producing above what our sort of long run equilibrium, our long run, we could even say capabilities of production are. If it's negative, well, it's a little bit worse. It's actually much worse. Why? Well, if it's negative, we're in a recession. We don't want to be in a recession. So when you think back to the Taylor rule, where I had the difference between like YT and YT star, right? YT star was potential GDP. The flexible price output we could also think of as potential GDP. So it's the difference between actual and potential GDP in this model. And this is what it looks like. So if we have this vertical aggregate supply curve, the flexible price output, YT superscript F, we can call it hashtag woke, because everybody's woke when prices can fully respond and everybody knows what's going to be happening. Well, everybody knows what's going to happen in either case of this model because, well, not what's going to happen, but they all have rational expectations. Now, the upward sloping aggregate supplier output curve, right, that is like the new Keynesian output curve or the new Keynesian like supply curve, where all three of these curves, where the aggregate demand, the output under the new Keynesian, and the flexible price output, where those three all intersect is the long run equilibrium of this model. That is the expected price level. Firms set their price each period, and when all firms get to set their price, that is the expected price level, that E of PT. When only some firms can set their price, but not all can do it, that is not an expected price level, right? That's just a change in the price level. The price goes up a little bit, but the expected price level won't change until we achieve a long run equilibrium again, where aggregate demand, short run aggregate supplier, that YT, and long run aggregate supply, YTF, all intersect again. Now, as I had said, if YT is greater than YTF, we have a positive output gap, which is here. If YT is less than YTF, we have a negative output gap, which is here. So what this is saying is if we are in a recession, the monetary authority is going to use monetary policy to try to close this negative output gap. So it's going to try to bring us back to our long-run equilibrium. If we are in a case where we have a positive output gap, the monetary authority is going to use monetary policy to try to close the output gap to bring us back to our long-run equilibrium. Now, monetary policy can't affect any supply-side factors, therefore it's not going to be affecting, it's not going to be shifting either the long run or the short run, or the flexible price, or the new Keynesian output curves. The only thing it can do is affect aggregate demand. It's going to shift aggregate demand around to try to achieve this long-run equilibrium. So when you think about trying to keep inflation low or around a now annual average of 2% and trying to minimize unemployment, that's just another way of saying they're trying to close the output gap, but keeping prices stable. They want price stability and a closed output gap. That's when things are good. So policymakers, the monetary authority in the United States, the Fed, is tasked with minimizing the output gap. Because when there's an output gap, be it positive or negative, there's an inefficiency in the equilibrium. Both welfare theorems aren't being satisfied. So if the policymaker is a benevolent one, and we'd like to assume that they are, they'll want to close this output gap to try to help things out a little bit. So we danced around a lot of this stuff with the central bank. We did it a little bit with the real business cycle model. We talked about it some with the time inconsistency in monetary policy. Actually, hell, we've talked about this all semester, to be honest with you. Central bank manages the money supply, kind of, as I have said. What they're doing is they actually set an interest rate and they allow the money supply to be set accordingly. And in this model, they follow what's called a Taylor rule, which is named after a super awesome dude named John Taylor. John Taylor is a badass. Now, if some of you maybe were following the news like 4 years ago when it came to some monetary policy stuff at the Fed, maybe you were, maybe you weren't. But Donald Trump, about 4 years ago, selected Jerome Powell to be the Fed chairman, right? So Jerome Powell was nominated under President Donald Trump. while the Dontron was thinking about who he wanted to select as Fed chairman, right? He had a list of names. One of the names was John Taylor. And that would have been kind of awesome. And Donald Trump made a lot of mistakes during his presidency. One of his biggest mistakes is not making John Taylor the chairman of the Fed, because that would be so cool. And yeah, I'm still really angry about this. On top of that, he also tried to fire Jerome Powell because of the Fed's plans to tighten monetary policy, which had really been in the works about a decade before Trump decided to run, because this all started, the plan to eventually tighten monetary policy came after quantitative easing in order to respond to the after effects of the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. But we'll learn a little bit more about that stuff, a little bit later. So the Taylor rule formulates policy in terms of interest rates, and it features an endogenous component of monetary policy. We've all seen this before, right? We did this in class a little bit. The only thing I've done is I've added this epsilon MT here. This is a source of shocks to monetary policy. So anytime there's a monetary policy shock, it enters through this guy right here. So the central bank also kind of plays another role because they face a trade-off between output and inflation, right? So this equation right here is going to explain how they're setting the interest rate. But this equation, as it is right here, isn't necessarily enough to really describe the functions of the monetary authority in this model, because they face a trade-off between output and inflation, which, as we know, is the Phillips curve. Now, other models kind of screwed this idea up, but the new Keynesian model fixes it, because the new Keynesian model ties the source of nominal rigidities, right, the fact that firms can't all change their prices, to the firm's real marginal costs. This means that there's a source of the nominal rigidity that can be explained by something within the model, not just something that we assumed happens, as a lot of other models are just like, well, it happens, so just hand wave it away, and that's that, whatever. Right? And that's not to say that it's not, this is different than the simplifying assumption of just that the Calvo pricing parameter omega is constant. This is different than that. Right? Because this is talking about the firm's real marginal costs and the way the firm sets their price relative to the expected, like the discounted present value of the firm's real marginal costs. So we get a new Keynesian Phillips curve, which is this guy right here. Now this looks like, well, a lot of crap. Like a lot of crap. It's probably going to be like, wow, this kind of sucks. Like, all the stuff we got to do? Well, not really. First off, remember that pi is just inflation. So for equation 4, the left-hand side, inflation is equal to this beta, which we'll talk about in a second, times the expectation of future inflation. So the expectation of future inflation is expected inflation. So, okay, this isn't too bad. This beta is a discount factor. It's really just a measure of how patient we are. And this gamma times 1 minus omega times 1 minus beta times omega over omega, this is the slope of the Phillips curve. And it reflects the real marginal cost for the firm. It reflects the real marginal cost as a function of firms that can and can't change their prices while also controlling for how patient they are in the future. So what I'm going to do is, well, what I already did was I solved equation 4 for y sub t. So I solved equation 4 for output rather than in inflation. So here we've got it in terms of inflation, but if I just solve it for yt, which is output, I get this right here. And I'm doing it like this for a very, very, very specific reason. Let's just go ahead and say that this 1 over gamma times omega over 1 minus omega times 1 minus beta omega, right? Because here it was this, but when I solve for yt, it flips. So let's go ahead and just assume that this guy right here, I can just set this equal to another variable, right? And just say all this crap is equal to something else, just equal to something that's a little bit smaller. That's a little bit easier to look at. So let's just set it equal to alpha for a minute. Why alpha? Well, because I feel like it. Well, if I do that, does this look a little familiar? Think about this for a second. Output equals YTF plus alpha times pi t minus, or alpha times inflation minus expected inflation. Deviations of inflation from expected inflation times alpha is going to add to the flexible price output. Well, what's the flexible price output? It's like a long run equilibrium output, right? Well, let's think about monetary policy and time inconsistency, the Barrow and Gordon model. Now, that was the Phillips curve. There's a slightly difference here because this one actually gives a source of the rigidities instead of just kind of hand waving it away, saying that it's a signal extraction problem for the firms. So what does this mean? Well, it means a central bank can influence output in the short run because not all firms can update their prices right away. In the long run, all firms can update their prices, which means they get smart, they get woke, right? Get woke in this case, don't go broke. And they set their prices expecting the central bank to screw around with prices more in the future, thus triggering inflation. So another way that I can label everything, instead of YT and YTF, right, I can have a long-run aggregate supply curve. It's a vertical aggregate supply curve. This is the aggregate supply curve from the real business cycle model. In this model, it treats that as the long-run aggregate supply curve. Why long run? Well, if we remember, right, what was the long-run equilibrium in response to, say, monetary policy and government spending shocks in the real business cycle model, right? Well, not in the tests of the real business cycle model. What was that? Well, if you go back to your notes and look at it, you'll see that it was basically back to zero, right? Output was returning back to where it was. So when that happens, we can sort of infer that as, okay, well, output's going to change a little in the short run, but it's going to return back to its long-run equilibrium in the long run. So since all that behavior worked in the long run, we can just treat the aggregate supply curve in the RBC model as the long-run aggregate supply curve in the new Keynesian model. Kind of cool. But that's the long run. We need a short-run aggregate supply, which is this blue curve here. This blue curve is the aggregate supply where prices are sticky. So if there's an increase in aggregate demand, say aggregate demand shifts and it's going where this little hand is going now, right? It's over like here, right? Well, output will increase, prices will increase. And then over time, as the price level begins to increase, as more firms can set their prices, short-run aggregate supply shifts inward and it eventually crosses the long-run aggregate supply at a higher level, at a higher price level. Output falls and returns back to where it was. Kind of like what we saw with those impulse response functions as the empirical test of the real business cycle model. And when that happens, firms set the expected price level up here. It's higher. And we're going to get into what that means in just a second. Because this goes back to how firms can set their price. So they can't set their price every period like they could in the RBC model. There's the probability omega that they can't, and the probability 1 minus omega that they can. So they've got to be forward-looking here when they actually can set their prices. And if the Fed's been screwing around with the money supply a lot, they're going to want to price high enough to basically cover their asses for the future. So if you're like, I'm going to increase my prices by 5% because I don't expect to be able to change my price for a year. But over the course of that year, there's a lot of the central bank screwing with the money supply. And if not all prices can change at once, well, there's going to be a major influx of demand. You got to make a lot more stuff in the short run, but in the long run, you get to raise your price a little bit. If, say, the monetary authorities' behavior, their increase in the money supply, is a lot higher than what you thought it was going to be, what do? Well, you're going to say, you know what? I'm setting my price even higher than that. I'm setting it more than just that 5% increase. I'm going to make it like a 10 or 15% increase because I really want to make sure that I cover my ass. And if you keep using monetary policy, expansionary monetary policy a lot, then I got to keep setting my price higher and higher and higher if I want to be able to at least break even, right? So the more the monetary authority screws with the money supply, the more firms are going to be raising their prices every chance that they get to raise their prices. So as the Fed inflates more more firms will include that past behavior in their current pricing strategy and they'll set higher prices, which means that we do have limits to monetary expansion. So let's take a look at how to play around with the new Keynesian Phillips curve. So step one is just figure out what the slope of the Phillips curve is. Let's say 20% of firms can't change their prices. Right? That means you got a 20% probability you can't change your price every period. So omega is equal to 0.2. 1 minus omega is equal to 0.8. And I'm just going to go ahead and let beta be equal to 0.99. And gamma is equal to 1. So beta, right, remember that's how much we care about the future relative to today. So that just says tomorrow is 99% as important as today is for us, which is going to be affecting our consumption savings behavior. Basically, it's going to affect our future planning. So if that's the case, we get this right here. The slope of the new Keynesian Phillips curve is, remember, 1 over gamma times omega divided by 1 minus omega times 1 minus beta times omega. So if we do that, we just plug everything in here and we get this. We get this. We can simplify it a little bit. Simplify it a little bit more. Finally, we get this. So the slope is 0.128. Slope of the Phillips curve here is 0.128. But what we really need is to understand how inflation relates to output. Right? Well, I plug that in to the new Keynesian Phillips curve as it's been solved for YT. Now, you can also do this stuff for pi t, but the computation is going to be just a little bit different. So most firms can change their prices because most of them can, right? 80% of them can change their price at any point in time. Deviations of inflation from expected inflation wouldn't matter all that much. Why? Well, more firms can change their price. So the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to be less affected by inflation than if, say, 80% of the firms couldn't change their price. So what if firms had less flexibility in their pricing strategy, right? What if 80% of firms couldn't change their prices instead of 20%? Well, if we let everything else be the same and all I do is just change omega, right? I get this, simplify it. This is really just plugging stuff into the calculator. Finally, I get this, 19.23. Slope of the Phillips curve is now 19.23, which means deviations from expected inflation really affect output in this case because fewer firms can change their prices. Now, what would this look like graphed out? Well, we need to know what we're going to graph here. New Keynesian Phillips curve relates output with inflation. Means it's an aggregate supply curve. But it's the short run aggregate supply curve because in the long run, remember, aggregate supply is independent of prices. And the RBC model, we only had one aggregate supply curve, which was long run aggregate supply. But now we've got two. We've got long run and short run aggregate supply. Now, remember, this was when I solved out this thing for the Phillips curve, right? What I had was output as a function of prices. But when I look at this guy graphed out, let me find where it is. I got prices in terms of output. Not to mention, this is the price level, and previously I had the rate of change of prices. So things are a little different here. But the intuition, the understanding of what we're looking at is still the same. And what I've got is, well, this flat short-run aggregate supply curve. When I look at it right here, this is technically the flatter of the two because here the slope was 0.128 and here it was 19.23. All right, so you'd be like, oh, well, this is the steeper one. Well, yeah, when it's output in terms of price, but when it's price in terms of output, right, this actually is the shallower one because what it means is that output is more responsive to a small change in price when it's 19.23 than it is when the slope of this is 0.128. Here, output isn't very responsive to a change in price. Therefore, if output isn't responsive to a change in price, that's going to be a steeper or a more vertical aggregate supply curve for the short run. Hence, the flexible price is steeper here. The sticky price is the flatter one. So as prices get more flexible, right? Because if there's a shock of aggregate demand shifts out, right? And it shifts out to where this little hand is here, right? So we just do a horizontal shift of aggregate demand out to this point. Well, if we look at it in terms of the flexible price, output would be like over here. In terms of the sticky price, it would be a little bit higher. Prices wouldn't respond as much under the sticky price short run aggregate supply curve as they would under the price one. Now, the perfectly flexible price is, well, perfectly flexible, so there's no change to output here. But as prices get stickier, output has to respond more and more and more. So it basically, if there's a shock, prices can't pick up all the slack, so output has to respond by the amount that prices can't. So the stickier prices are, the fewer firms can adjust their prices, the flatter the short run aggregate supply curve is. Therefore, if there's an aggregate demand shock, you're going to have a much larger increase in output than you are in price. Of course, that's for the short run, because remember, in the long run, everything's going to shift back in. And that short run aggregate supply curve, as you'll see in the next video, kind of how this stuff sort of shifts around. When you look at it, whether prices are sticky or not, doesn't matter, because it's going to go right back to the equilibrium between aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. So it would be independent of the slope of the Phillips curve in the long run. Therefore, whether we've got sticky prices or flexible prices, in the long run, we're going to have a higher price level either way. So what makes this reasoning for nominal rigidity so interesting and convincing as well is that it ties the inability to alter pricing with the firm's real marginal costs. So it gives a more economically intuitive explanation or approach to what the source is of these nominal rigidities that everybody had been arguing existed, but they couldn't ever really mathematically put it into a model that made any sort of intuitive sense. The new Keynesian model fixed that, right? It gave us a good intuitive understanding of the source of these nominal rigidities. And that's what gives the monetary authority the ability to use monetary policy to influence real economic activity. If prices can't all change at once, right, like they could in the real business cycle model, then output has to change, as I said, to pick up some of the slack to make sure that we still reach an equilibrium. So without evidence, we could gather that this would mean we could just always increase the money supply and face absolutely no harm for it, right? Well, nope, wrong. Like I said, there are limits to how much the central bank can expand the money supply. In the short run, we have real effects from monetary expansion, as we'll see in some graphs in the next video. But in the long run, everybody gets hashtag woke, and firms start to catch on to what the central bank is doing. And they're like, right? Like that, the Kembe Mutombo video in Geico, he's like, oh, no, 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 not in my house, right? The firms are doing the exact same thing here. They're like, I don't think so. Not in my house. And instead of blocking a shot, they're going to block the ability of the central bank to influence output later because, well, they're going to have to inflate even more than they'd be willing to inflate. Therefore, central bank can only inflate so much before they either don't want to inflate anymore or they risk wrecking the economy. So in this case, if you get woke, you don't go broke. Bad joke. And they set their expected price level to be higher than what it was before to make sure they don't get screwed by the central bank. Because if the central bank keeps inflating more and more and more, well, these firms are going to lose out on their profits. They don't want to do that. I mean, like, who does, right? Why am I going to produce something if I'm going to be losing money overall? So they set their expected price level to be higher than it was. The central bank inflates, the more firms are going to be setting higher and higher and higher prices whenever they can set their higher prices. So if the central bank wants to try to boost output all the time using monetary expansion, they're going to pay the price with high inflation. This is what happened during the 1970s, and it's at least partly to blame for the entire decade being called a lost decade. So while the long-run aggregate supply curve is independent of prices, it's fairly obvious that short-run aggregate supply isn't. So if P sub t changes, we end up at a new point of y sub t on the same short run aggregate supply curve. But if the expected level were to change, it shifts. So let me say that again. If it's only P sub t that changes, right? P sub t is the vertical axis on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply space. So if PT changes, we move to a new point on the same short run aggregate supply curve, right? Because that's something that can be explained by one of the axes in the little graph. The expected price level, on the other hand, is not the axis on that graph. Therefore, if the expected price level changes, short run aggregate supply will shift. This may not make a ton of sense now, but when you see the ISLM stuff for the new Keynesian model, you'll go, oh, I see what he's talking about. But I'm driving this point home now. If the price level changes, new point on the same short run aggregate supply, the expected price level changes, short run aggregate supply will shift. It'll either shift up or down. And firms are altering their prices based on the expectation of the future. So if the monetary authority wants to screw around with the money supply, the price level goes up. And firms begin to expect higher future prices. Therefore, they're going to increase the expected price level, which is shifting the short run aggregate supply curve up. Now, while an upward shift in aggregate demand is good, an upward shift in short run aggregate supply, right, because it's an inward shift really, so it's shifting up, it's upward sloping aggregate supply curve, but it's shifting in, right? Looks like it's shifting up. That's not good because it means firms are supplying the same quantity as they were before, but at a much higher price. So in this case, it's bad. This is what it's going to look like if we have a monetary policy shock. What happens is, and we'll see this in greater detail when I explain some of the ISLM stuff, but what happens is, let's start here. So we're starting where this little white hand is. This is the initial equilibrium. I've got a blue aggregate demand curve, and I have a blue short run aggregate supply curve. And the flexible price output, which is like a purplish, looks almost like it's the pink, but it's not quite. It's a little purple. Remember, this is independent of prices. So this will never, ever, 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 ever move in response to a monetary policy shock. So what happens when there's a monetary policy shock? Well, aggregate demand shifts out first. So aggregate demand is going to shift out. So we go from AD0 up to AD1. So this is step one, aggregate demand shifts. Step two, this was our equilibrium. Now this is our equilibrium. So where the white hand is now, at the intersection between YT0, which is short run aggregate supply, and AD1, which is the new aggregate demand curve, the intersection of those two is where output is and where the price level is. Now the price level goes up a little bit, but notice it doesn't go up all the way yet. Output goes up a little bit. But as firms get to set their prices, right, the share of firms that are allowed to set their prices increases. When that happens, aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, is going to shift inward. So step three here is short run aggregate supply goes from YT0, this nice little blue curve, up to this pink curve, YT1. And then when it goes up, we are now at a higher expected price level. So if I were to draw a little dotted line here from AD1 and YT0, this would be like PT1 or PT star, PTS for short run, something like that, right? It would not be E of PT. So because it's just PT, well, we're on this curve here. But as the expected price level goes up, this label is not the expected price level, and this label is not the expected price level. Therefore, if there's a change in the expected price level, the short run aggregate supply curve shifts in, and it shifts in up until it intersects with aggregate demand and long run aggregate supply. When those three intersect, we have an expected price level again. So the long run equilibrium in the new Keynesian model after a shock is the same as any equilibrium after a demand side shock, well, after a monetary policy shock, in the real business cycle model. Only the price level changes in the long run. But in the short run, on the other hand, the price level does change a little bit. So we have to deal with slightly higher prices, but we get higher output. Now, this is just looking at it beginning in an equilibrium and ending in an equilibrium. But sometimes there's like a negative output gap if the central bank wants to try to influence this stuff. So we'd actually have aggregate demand like all the way over here. And in that case, the central bank would try to push aggregate demand out a little bit. And we would have a short run increase in output. And then it would kind of go back to, well, where it was originally. And then we would have higher prices, but output back at the long run. So while this shows just, a nice, good, efficient equilibrium, they want to increase output in the short run, great, you get to deal with higher prices. But if we're down here, right, we're in a recession, and it's a demand side factor that's causing that recession, right, then the central bank can increase aggregate demand via a monetary policy shock to reduce this output gap, shrink the output gap back to the long run equilibrium. So if we are in a recession, according to the new Keynesian model, having a monetary authority step in and exercise monetary policy is actually kind of a good thing. So, okay, limits to monetary expansion. Well, I kind of explained all this stuff already, but if we're thinking about the ISLM stuff, when there's a money supply increase, there's a shift in the LM curve, which triggers a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand shifts out. We deviate from the long run aggregate supply to short run aggregate supply. As I said, this increases price a bit, but it also increases output. As more firms update their prices, short run aggregate supply shifts in. As the expected price level, E of PT, goes up. We end up back at the long run aggregate supply, where short run equals long run aggregate supply equals aggregate demand, and we have a higher expected price level. So if the Fed wants to increase the money supply more and more and more, the price level is going to go up more and more and more. For those of you that have been watching the news recently, there are major projections for extremely high inflation in the coming future. Why is that? Well, after the COVID-19 pandemic, the Federal Reserve basically just used wildly expansionary monetary policy. To an extent, was it the right move? Yes. But there are things to worry about now, because as the economy begins to recover, more people want to spend more money, right? Because that's, the aggregate demand shock that gets triggered by the expansion of the money supply. There's other stuff as well. There's also the fiscal policy component. But remember, monetary and fiscal policy are not the same thing. However, aggregate demand shifts out as a result of either. In this case, we're thinking about it only as a result of monetary policy. As more and more people go back to work, right? They get more money. They want to spend more. But even though they're going back to work, that doesn't mean production just immediately, boom, responds, right? Because there's that zero impact restriction I talked about, impulse response functions. It takes a minute for output to really fully respond, because if you go to work and you're making stuff, right? You work on a factory line somewhere. Well, you have to make the stuff before that stuff can actually hit the market. Well, you'll be paid by the end of the week. That product may not actually hit the market for another month. So you're going to want to go out and spend a bunch of money on very limited numbers of goods, right? Well, if there's a lot of money chasing not enough goods, inflation. So that's kind of how we're dealing, or one of the reasons why we're dealing with the possibility of much higher inflation in the foreseeable future. There are a lot of concerns about that. So as the economy recovers, the Federal Reserve is going to be using a policy kind of similar to what they were trying to do prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and Donald Trump being Donald Trump and trying to push his weight around at the Federal Reserve. Can't believe he did that. They're eventually going to try to unwind their balance sheet again. And as they unwind their balance sheet, right, the level of reserve balances in the economy will kind of wind back down a little bit. And while M2 has increased massively since 2020, it money growth will kind of slow and eventually everything will kind of be okay. But we're going to deal with higher inflation for a little bit. And that's sadly just a fact of life. Now, this says that the central bank can boost output in the short run above the output gap, which works because, yeah, like I said, all firms can't adjust their prices at once. But once they can, they set a higher price. I know it sounds like I'm saying this over and over and over and over and over again, but I'm really trying to drive this point home. This is a very, very important topic when it comes to monetary policy. So firms set a higher price, and these firms are forward looking. So it's set because they expect the Fed to screw the price level some more in the future. So they set the high price now as a precaution, which hurts consumers. So the central bank can't always try to do this because it can really screw everyone over if they do push too hard with it. A lot of opponents of the Federal Reserve are currently saying that, well, the Fed was just reckless during the COVID-19 pandemic response. I am not one of those people. I am one of the people that is of the belief that the Federal Reserve made the right choice. They kicked the can down the road, but would you rather deal with inflation when the economy is doing well, or would you rather deal with inflation when the economy is not doing well? I don't know about you. I'll take the higher inflation if it meant that things weren't as bad as they could have possibly been. So I don't want to inject more of my opinion in this. It's fairly obvious. I am a new Keynesian when it comes to monetary policy in terms of affecting the business cycle. There's really no point in hiding that because it's like, okay, there's this model that I really like that I think really describes the way the economy operates, and it explains a lot of the variation in economic variables over time. So, yes, woohoo, I'm a new Keynesian. But this is a pretty cool model, and it really explains a lot. You can really do a lot even with just the baseline new Keynesian model. So, with that said, we're going to talk about some graphs next. Well, more graphs. And we're going to explain sort of like what the transmission mechanism of monetary policy is in the new Keynesian model and what that means for, well, overall just the aggregate economy and the way everything responds and how, unemployment can respond in the short run, but not the long run, just like output responds in the short run, but not the long run. And we can see all of these things and how all of this works. And then we'll go back to those impulse response functions we looked at before, and we'll be able to see, like, hey, you know, we now have a story for why these things are increasing, right? Why output is increasing in the short run, but not in the long run. So we're going to look at some static graphs, just like we saw with the RBC model, and then we're going to go to the impulse response functions, and then we'll do a special topics thing on the financial crisis, on the response to the financial crisis, and I'll probably throw a little bit in there with the COVID-19 pandemic and the Fed's response to the pandemic. So with all that said, thank you for watching, and we will reconvene in the next video.